Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I am here with Brendan Graham Dempsey. Some of you in this space may know him as the leader of Metamodern Spirituality. He's focused on creatively answering some of the contemporary crises we face, the meta crises. He's been hanging out with John Vervaeke and Layman Pascal. He's been building a retreat. He's exploring art and theology and all the kinds of humanistic projects that are coming after postmodernism. Welcome, Brendan, to the program.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited. Been wanting to dig into a number of topics with you, and I'm looking forward to this. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Totally. Well, lovely. And you're up in Vermont with animals around you in the fundamental natural spiritual place. It's a beautiful thing. And so listen, folks, there's some birds behind there and cats and everything else. It's a glorious thing. And I'm feeling that nature-loving spiritual connection. So hey, in terms of the way we start here, I'm a clinician. And so I like narrative. I like people's stories in terms of at least just situating how you got to this place, what's your version of reality and all of that. So can you share for folks kind of where you're coming from in that regard?
Sure. And hopefully by the end, you can diagnose me as well. So
right. I'm not super big I'm big on conceptualizing people rather than diagnosing them.
All right. Very good. Well, yeah, no, let's see. So yeah, as you said, I focus on sort of the spiritual side of developments in metamodern culture and kind of the mythological, metaphysical, narratological, philosophical sort of angle.
Is there a way to blend like myth and science together? Is that possible, Brendan?
Right. And so that's why it's been so exciting to see you and many others who are sort of, in this space, like trying to do this thing or participate in this sort of bigger endeavor, which has really been captivating me for, the better part of, over a decade at this point.
Really? Wow. You got into this thing early then, huh?
Yeah, well, so as I guess as early as I could, in the sense that I grew up in a very religious family, and started out kind of in a pretty conservative religious sphere, and
Christian conservative or
evangelical Christian.
Well, I live in Stuart Strath, Virginia, friend. We're fairly clear about what that lifestyle's like.
Well, it's funny actually, because I grew up in Vermont, and so we're sort of, that evangelical context is sort of like a fish out of water in this sort of situation. But then again, at least in some ways, there's certainly an ethos that certain strands of evangelicalism pick up on of sort of embracing that isolationist, victim mentality as well. So that kind of plays into that as well. But anyway, I grew up in a kind of conservative strand of evangelicalism, and but I was always really interested in just like matters of ultimate concern, I guess you could call it, to use sort of
a quick
phrase. Right.
I'm a big fan of that frame.
Yeah. And so I mean, that's how I'd phrase it now. At the time, what that looked like was through the lens of evangelical Christianity. And so I got really into that. I wanted to study it. And basically, when I went to college, I'd already started kind of getting into biblical scholarship and things like that, because I wanted to kind of take a seminary track and maybe even wind up teaching at a seminary or something, like teaching, biblical studies or something.
Right.
So I got to college and I started studying religion. And also around that time, when a lot of people start to broaden their horizons a bit and encounter new ideas and all sorts of things. I mean, some of this had already been happening for me for a few years earlier as well, but sort of a gradual kind of transition into, kind of more rationalist mode of thinking about things. And the study of religion as kind of a anthropological category. And so thinking about it interpretively, the University of Vermont had, and I think still has, though there's been a recent row, as many liberal arts universities have been experiencing around, like, basically the department almost got cut recently. But there was a time when the religion department was really one of a very, solid forefront, in the field of kind of religious anthropology. And So yeah, studied religion from that lens, and also continued sort of my biblical studies trajectory.
Okay.
And this just sort of opened up that whole world into a series of sort of frameworks that weren't part of my initial way of looking at it at all. In fact, seemed to kind of run directly counter to it, you know. So in like a kind of conservative evangelical sort of mythos, it's like, well, Moses wrote the Torah, and the, you know, disciples wrote the Gospels, and this sort of a thing. And then when you start studying composition and you learn the languages and you're kind of learning all the arguments for source theory and all that sort of stuff, you're like, oh, wow, actually, this is a lot more complicated than these texts are, you know. And so that kind of initiated this sort of like, well, hey, what gives? You know what? All this stuff that I learned, but then this, and I was, you know, just by via the argument.
The old what gives development, you know, it's like, we've been there, right?
Yeah. So I had a what gives moment, and wasn't really finding any sort of satisfactory answers to all of that, and felt like I wasn't really in a position at that time to I think do what many people do, which is sort of reorient themselves still within a faith tradition, but sort of by expanding it to, you know, include this sort of thing. I just sort of saw it like, oh wow, well, that's not true.
Okay.
So yeah, I had this sort of grand, you know, messy existential crisis as a result of all that, as one needs to do.
If you're going to grow, you know, you have to break into what I would call the systems of justification you were conventionally raised in, and all of a sudden shake that shit up.
Exactly. Yes, so that's a good way of framing that within that talk framework, right? It was sort of kind of a conflicting systems of justification, and sort of I kind of chose where I landed on that one. And so anyway, then I entered this sort of really uncertain, crazy time, because I was supposed to be heading off, you know, to like teach seminary and do this and that, and now it was sort of like, well, wait a second, what do I do now? So kind of my whole career was sort of upended because of that. So after that, after I graduated, I took a pretty hardcore turn towards art, which had always been something that I was passionate about from early days. And I went and lived in an artist collective in Burlington for about 4 years. And under the influence of this sort of philosophy couple that kind of were the sort of patriarch and matriarch of this really interesting artist collective. And yeah, wait, what's that?
I said, I bet that would be fascinating.
Yeah, no, it was a really interesting sort of dynamic. I was basically living in this little like pantry room off of the kitchen that was like basically the size of a closet, but I was like decorating it with like, you know, neoclassical pillars, and like I went this sort of hardcore neoclassical turn. I started dressing up. I got really into dandyism at the time. It was an odd moment, but I was really fascinated by the whole like Western canon and the whole Western kind of cultural tradition, which I discovered via my classics background, which I did originally because I wanted to learn Greek to read the New Testament. But in the process, I also started reading Homer and reading Sophocles and all this other stuff. And I, you know, fell in love with the classical world, and that just sort of like exploded all this other stuff. So I think in retrospect, I think it was very much a sort of substitute for this sort of like lack of a worldview that I had at the time. That I sort of went from this, you know, kind of, oh yes, the world is this way, to all the, you know, oh, I don't know what the world is at all. It's all chaos and a void and, you know, chance and all this and that. And so then turned to this sort of this sort of notion of seeking for the transcendent in aesthetics and in art. And beautiful. So I spent about 4 years there, reading basically just more than I'd ever read before, trying to make my way through, you know, as much of the Western canon as I could, and did a lot of that, you know, read all of Shakespeare and all the Greek tragedies and everything, and just sort of fell in love. I did a lot of traveling at that time too, and the main thing I was doing too at this period was writing. So I started writing this work that would later basically take me the whole 4 years that I was doing this, which was this epic poem about the death of God. And so, yeah, I was on a train in Turin, and I was reading Keats, and his poem Hyperion, you know, begins with it's Saturn. Saturn is, you know, has been dethroned and everything, and he's in this forest, and he's sort of like, you know, dealing with his deposition and all this stuff. And I was reading it, and I was just like, wow, this is how I feel about like my own experience of sort of the Judeo-Christian God has sort of like fallen. Right. And I of course also kind of felt that was something culturally that people had kind of gone through, as, you know. so I felt like this would be a really interesting way to at least begin a poem. And then I began it, and it kind of just kept going for a number of years. So it became this sort of 24 canto epic poem in blank verse that begins with this war in heaven and the ouster of God. And then the speaker of the poem sort of is like, comes to the conclusion that, well, gosh, we do still need myth and story and beauty and transcendence. And so kind of following the kind of epic trope of the catabasis, or the descent into the underworld, the speaker decides to go in search of God and see if he can, basically bring God back to the world in some way. And so that's kind of what the poem becomes, is sort of this story about resurrecting the sacred in some way. And of course, many things don't go entirely as expected. And so this was a really kind of pivotal, really kind of therapeutic, really, actually.
Sure.
Kind of a
this
is kind of a cathartic working through of all this material. And
it's the you're the authoring and the unfolding of your own sort of spiritual journey, basically. That's what it sounds like.
Exactly. It was very much a kind of spiritual autobiography, but one I felt that was also sort of tied to cultural history as well, right? This sort of like
totally
trying to understand what we have gone through in the culture from sort of this decline of religion and sort of the loss of religious sensibility, and then the sort of entrance of a kind of postmodern malaise that follows after that, and the sort of longing for transcendent ideals and all that. And then, the fraught kind of quest to, what do you do about that? And, as we were just kind of mentioning.
Well, this is actually really interesting.
This endeavor to try to,
So,
no, go on.
Well, I'll tell the story of my dad. So my dad was raised in like a Methodist, normal Protestant, normative Protestant structure, goes to a Billy Graham concert and has an evangelical conversion, comes home, and for then, and I believe this is his, late teens, early 20s, and then has a 10-year see the light reality of conversion. And then, but then there are aspects of the church he can't quite get around, predestination, other kinds of things. And he learns more and more about history, and ultimately, shifts right as he's about ready to get ordained. He shifts and ultimately becomes a history professor. This is in his 30s. And then I'm the third of our children. And by the time I come along, we get raised in an atheistic Dawkins-esque type of household. And I get birthed into then the scientific, naturalistic, material worldview, of which I embrace in a particular way, only to find myself as I get further and further into this abyss of psychology and the current state of affairs and the meaning mental health crisis. I didn't have a language for it then, but really even in the analytical structure of understanding what we are and the fundamental dissatisfaction of that structure, and then flipping into what is a potential picture that then I feel called to call the tree of knowledge and then follow that into a garden. That arc has a hell of a lot of parallels with the arc you just narrated, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And in your case, sort of cross-generational.
That's exactly right. It's like we put my dad and me together and cross it on your accelerated line. It was like, oh my God, it's like these are two totally different parallel lines.
and I think that kind of what you were just naming is kind of where this leads, is sort of, when you're, because how does one, both as an individual and then arguably collectively, go from this sort of atheistic, reductionistic, purely materialistic kind of framework to something that can sort of breathe life back into the world with a kind of non-simplistic, non-naive, science-friendly kind of re-enchantment endeavor, right?
The thrust of the whole mission of the podcast, UTOKing with Gregg podcast, is in search of a coherent naturalistic ontology that can revitalize the soul and spirit, give breath to the soul and spirit and the human soul and spirit in the 21st century. So I couldn't agree more with regards to where we find ourselves in this time between worlds. 100%.
Yeah, that's sort of, so that's kind of, just to wrap up my own kind of, biographical background with this stuff, that was sort of where I was at. I finished that poem and I kind of worked through a lot and was starting to appreciate, both by means of doing this aesthetically, but also in terms of kind of the ideas of it all, that there was this really powerful way in which art was involved here, and that creativity and that the notions of divinity are themselves something that creatively evolve and shift and move with culture. And then there's this sort of like invitation to be like, wow, well, if God sort of, or divinity sort of, or the sacred, whatever you want to call it, needs to sort of keep evolving. And if that happens, at least in some ways, by means of human creativity and the arts, then what a beautiful sort of thing. And so I
lovely.
At that point felt like I could kind of re-engage spirituality again, but from sort of a very different angle now. And I went to, I enrolled and got accepted into this Yale master's program called, the diploma was in religion and the arts, and I was in the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, which sort of focuses on the nexus between aesthetics and divinity.
Wow.
And so I did that program and came out, and that was certainly very influential as well. And basically since then, I've just been trying to kind of continue that project forward of, now it's not this sort of, how would I put it? Well, yeah, I guess to maybe frame that a little differently, it's just that, all right, now that you can kind of situate it as this is some really compelling and meaningful work that needs to be done, right? And arguably very urgently needed, and is sort of, it's sort of like demanding of poets and artists and sort of aesthetically minded people of all stripes to kind of get involved with the articulation, the rearticulation, the reimagination of spirituality these days. And the last thing I guess I'll say in all of this is sort of like, well, what does metamodernism and all this fit in? And so just real briefly on that, as I was writing this poem, I was doing a lot of reading, as I said, about, just history and philosophy and all this stuff.
Right.
I sort of got a pretty good handle. I felt like it. Oh yeah. Okay. This is what's sort of been unfolding. And I was reading a lot about postmodernism and it all kind of clicked. And then I was like, well, what is after postmodernism, right? Because there is this feeling I'd already kind of managed to get out of, which is, especially when you're thrown into this sort of disorienting void of meaninglessness and nihilism, that you want to look back and you want to find where things did make sense. And so you often will kind of be pushed to reactionarily kind of regress to something more traditional and simplistic. And I learned that that's not the way, that won't work. And so I was like, well, what's forward, what's not, because there's no shortage of people reacting against postmodernism and the whole cultural ethos of it.
Right. You hear about name of Jordan Peterson? I don't know if you ever heard of that guy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long list. There's a long, but certainly, and so it was sort of like, well, yeah. So if we're not going to go back, the only way out is through. So what's postmodernism? So I started looking into that and found metamodernism, and this would have been around 2013 or so. But I found the work of Vermeulen and von Daniker and the stuff that they were describing just aesthetically was just like, yes. I think you've had this sort of experience too, where you're reading about metamodernism and you're like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been doing. Like, this is,
amazing.
This is just these words that are given to it. So I got really involved in that pretty early on, actually. So in 2014, they had their first Metamodernism in the Humanities conference in Glasgow. And I presented a paper there and was sort of pretty involved with this sort of what was then only just the cultural studies side of metamodernism.
Right.
And did that, but that was sort of a niche field sort of in academia, and that didn't really, there wasn't a whole lot of more collective or activist sort of momentum that kind of came from that until 2017, and then the Hansi book came out, and then this community started to form, so around 2019 I was getting, kind of taking the lay of the land after doing some more kind of writing and stuff for a while. And I was realizing, wow, this whole metamodernist community has really sprung up. And now it's got all these other really beautiful lineages thrown in and interacting with all these other things and, theories of everything and integral theory and this sort of stuff. And I just finally found like, yes, these are my people. So that's basically the
welcome
story.
Brother, I hear it, man.
Right? Yeah,
preach it. That's totally right.
Great to be here.
Yes, the brotherhood is deep. So in 2011 I produced a new unified theory of psychology, which I've characterized as literally not knowing anything about metamodern, as a postmodern grand meta narrative. And it's a return to truths with the postmodern critique held that affords the synthesis between the thesis, the antithesis, and enables us to, move forward. And I had no idea. And then I got turned into the arts. You mentioned something that I really actually, the connection between divinity and aesthetics. I think is the way you characterize the studies you were in. That just piqued my curiosity. May have to come back to that. So for me, in my scientist and humanistic kind of frame, as a psychologist and psychotherapist, I get very oriented toward sort of the truth science side and the goodness, what I call goodness well-being side of the equation. But I'm underdeveloped on aesthetics fundamentally, in terms of if we think about the big transcendence and my fundamental appreciation for the underlying epistemology, ontology of aesthetics. And so anyway, just hearing you say that, I was like, because then what happened to me as my synthesis of science and humanities this way, it essentially converged on a creative expressive impulse. There's this sort of mythopoetic beauty in a particular kind of way. And so it's really interesting for me, and I still think I'm underdeveloped on sort of philosophy of aesthetics. But there's a calling inside of me to weave my science, humanistic, or integrity, goodness sides together that affords a particular beautiful way of being in the world. John's transjective framings and recursive relevance realization, capture me in that way. So anyway, maybe we'll come back to that. But that's a real beautiful kind of setup in relation.
Well, but it's interesting too, right? Because it's a community, like no one person has to kind of have all the pieces, right? Because like I might have more of an emphasis on the aesthetic side, but I'm definitely going to be a lot weaker on the more hardcore science stuff that you and others have. And so it's a lovely kind of harmonization and integration of sort of people's different skills and talents that it's a very kind of collaborative an ethos and kind of a co-creative sort of environment. So it's and in fact, actually, this is sort of maybe a decent enough sort of little segue to get into what I'm currently up to, which is I think the most exciting element of all this, because as I say, I think of myself primarily as an artist, actually, or as a poet, which I don't know, may or may not come as a surprise to some people who just mainly interact with me as a person through my podcasts and stuff like that. But mainly I do that because I want to connect with people, I want to hear their ideas, and I want to help this whole thing, right? But in terms of what I feel like I can, like where my strengths are and what I can actually contribute, they're largely in the realm of aesthetics. And so my passion is sort of to take your work and the work of Hansi and others, and this emerging sort of this postmodern meta narrative, and translate that postmodern meta narrative into an aesthetic myth poetic production to kind of help propagate the ideas in a way that sort of has that kind of artistic energy or potency in a way that so much of this stuff is in books that are sort of they're very detail oriented, they're very footnotes and this sort of a thing, right? But in terms of like, and you understand this too, of course, with the thing with your garden and all that, it's like trying to translate these ideas into ways that are can be really put into the culture more broadly in symbolic form and literary form in my case. So that's sort of my current passion, and where I see the next maybe 10 years of my life being devoted to.
That's so beautiful. And that's exactly right. Obviously, I mean, it's the artists that are going to generate the creative expression that will then speak to people in a fundamentally different kind of way. I have that calling now as a much lesser calling than what I'm trained for. My trained for is, I'm a theorist that dives into the arcane analysis of particular kinds of concepts, and then, learns deeply about them and then places them in right relationship to another in an analytic integrity frame. But that's, okay, that may be important, but who gives a shit at one level? And at least in terms of the everyday life. It is relevant in the way we organize knowledge, certainly from my vantage point, but not necessarily relevant, although there's pieces of the UTOK system that are definitely relevant, but it's not relevant in relationship to, that moves me in a particular way, where I see that and it captures the fundamental, intuitive perspectival grip I have on the world, or things like that. And that's what art is so powerful in doing. So that's beautiful. Yeah. think we're having some connection here. I'm gonna pause. Yeah, so I was just saying, I mean, to me, the cultivation of that aesthetic is such, and it's so crucial. And really, if this collective intelligence is going to come together and have an impact, it's us with each of our little threads getting woven together in a tapestry, and what our talents can be brought together and then create some sort of synergistic blend of all those lines.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, no, I was just, and I mean, the way that I look at this too is that the kind of the aesthetics of metamodernism, even going back to the initial kind of framing of, Vermeulen and von Daniker, sort of, what's the word, that they're very conducive to this sort of a project, let's say, right? Whether it's the sincere irony, whether it's the return to kind of mythic, there are specific lines in their works that really name this very well in terms of contrasting, like these are kind of typically postmodern strategies compared to, maybe what we're seeing as typically metamodern strategies. And I think Hansi does a good job of sort of embodying some of that stuff too, with the sincere irony and the pseudonymous figure, and this sort of playing with reality element. But yeah, I mean, it's there. And then I think that was, when I found it, was one of the things that kind of sang to me about it all, was that it was like, here's a way to sort of re-engage mythos in a kind of post-naive way, right? It's not this sort of more traditional way of what are the stories and how has it always been, right? It's sort of like engaging that register, but doing it more so from the level of like, okay, now we're going to engage this register, and so you're sort of a willing participant in the theatrics of it. And anyway, so there's a whole kind of really aesthetic theory behind all this stuff too, which just really lends itself to this sort of a project.
Yeah, I love that. One of the more moving collective intelligence sort of spiritual moments I had was with sincere irony. I was coming across that concept. I'm not sure if it's exactly the first time I heard it or not, but I was literally reading it and I landed across sincere irony and I basically froze, because I then was completely captured by the fact that the entire sensibility that drove me to make this cartoon garden thing, it's unbelievably, ironic and at the same time deeply sincere simultaneously. And it was a very, very, I had no idea that was even a genre or sensibility when I was called to do it. And then to see that my calling fits, in 2016, I'm being called in this very weird way. I mean, academics don't normally do that kind of shit, it's like, and yet I felt compelled. People were like, what the hell are you doing? It's like, well, I'm just going to have to do this thing. And then to realize that genre or that aesthetic was actually now emerging collectively, and it captures exactly kind of, to me, it was like, that's a weird collective intelligence vacuum that I'm getting like pulled into here.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
What's really cool too, which I haven't really heard discussed much, but it's an idea that really intrigues me and could potentially be of great sort of pragmatic use for this sort of endeavor, which is that when you're working in that register, right? Yes, you can engage with art of that kind with a full-on metamodern, sincere, ironic kind of engagement, right? But it also works if you're not fully engaging it in that way either, right? So like your garden is a wonderful thing that could be, like that it could be hanging on the wall of a kindergarten or something, right? Or a fifth grade or something, right? And it's sort of like, this is just then part of the sort of cultural world that we're in. But then of course there's so much depth to it that it sort of then has the potential to be unpacked, and it's like, oh wow, there's a lot more here. But that's arguably one of the marks of, really wonderful and enduring work of art, is that it can kind of be appreciated at so many different levels. So the sincerity of metamodernism, right? It's like it works at a metamodern level of sincere irony, but it also works for more traditional minded folks who just are maybe going to pick up more on the sincerity side,
right?
And it also works for the postmodernists who are going to enjoy the irony of it. So you're kind of doing this sort of what's the word? There's sort of something for everyone. There's sort of it's a polyvalent sort of potential work, which I think that myth needs to be, if it's going to be, if it's going to work, if it's really going to kind of sink into people's consciousnesses and into the culture. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. In fact, the garden itself, kindergarten is actually a particular frame of reference. And I work with some people that did early childhood education. And we actually laid out a little schematic of a nursery school centered around the theme of a garden, which actually has happened a number of different places. And you could imagine that kind of both the aesthetic and then the educational structure and the ethos that could be brought to bear and then begin the educational structure. And I mean that kind of in a Zach Steinian sense of like a fundamental intergenerational transmission of knowledge and wisdom across the sort of, that's part of the the architectural design is actually structured in part to have that as a thread. So
yeah, no, I was some of this stuff started to really kind of pick up for me when I was in that master's program, because we were even looking at sort of the Bible from the lens of the language itself might be rather simplistic, right? And there's a lot of, you can just kind of read it and okay, you get the basic story, right? But of course, there's so much richness then to the interpretation and the meaning and the cultural kind of all the different layers of things that so Meyer Sternberg was a thinker in the sort of vein who kind of talks about this. I think it was the Poetics of Biblical Narrative, but I think it applies to myth more generally, as well, and it also applies to enduring works like Shakespeare, right, where like you can show up in the penny seats and get a good sex joke in there, but then you're also like listening to Hamlet opine on the nature of existence, and it's sort of like when you can have that much range, that's kind of, I think, the greatest possibility in which these things can have, their greatest sort of potential impact in the culture.
Lovely. So there's 6,000 different directions we could potentially go. I've got a number. Are there things that you want to cover? Obviously, that afford us an opportunity to make sure we get covered here.
No, not really. I'm
okay.
Fire at me.
All right. So now in terms of like. You've cultivated this retreat. I'm coming up actually and hanging out with some of my.
I wanted to make sure that got in there because I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But yeah,
okay. Well, certainly. I mean, basically, then I want to also talk about the conversation that you were having with Layman and John Vervaeke, and where are we, in this arc of metamodern spirituality? You talk about the next 10 years of where we are. So I want to talk about that. The other thing I'm curious about is a little dark Renaissance controversy, in relationship to the video. And I watched on the side of that thing, was trying to chime in for some Game B support when I was on Bard's list. And I kind of I'd be curious to circle in and get your take on that reality as watching some of I had a pretty good affinity for the little video that came out in relation and just that whole experience on that side. So those are at least some of the things. And then I kind of want to get into, what is sacred, and then because John and I are working on sort of an extended sacred naturalism, also with Bruce, excuse me, and Layman. And I'd like to talk to you about this sort of religion that's not a religion, or where we need to go and where I am in relationship to sort of, I adopt some of Bard's language and syntheism, and I'd like to talk to you about that. So those are just some of the things that popped into my head. So like I said, it's a smorgasbord. Let me dump those out and see what you want to pick up on.
Well, I'll try to touch on all of it. Maybe save some of the dark Renaissance stuff, which is sort of the least meldable in towards the end of it. But okay. So let's see. I think to kind of from the beginning, where I'm at with a lot of this stuff, and notions of the sacred and things of that nature. Okay, so John, I think, does a really good job at framing the kind of intellectual history behind where we're at in the meaning crisis, obviously. Sure. And I think he does a good job, and other people have said this as well, that when you look back at sort of those axial age religions, right, that if there's sort of certain kinds of metaphysical common denominators there's sort of this two worlds mythology, right? And there's sort of the immanent and the transcendent, however you want to frame that or phrase it. It's different in the different traditions, but heaven and earth and that, that sort of a thing. And then so, arguably then we go through this whole period via the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, where we sort of lose the transcendent side of that more and more and sort of start focusing more and more on what we would think of as the immanent, and we sort of cut. And so actually this work here, which is the first work now in the Metamodern Spirituality series, Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence, is sort of all about this idea, which is that we sort of cut away transcendence. And this is a very obviously simplistic kind of way of framing all this, but one way of thinking about it would be this. And so then this process kind of goes all the way into postmodernism, where, at least in modernism, as people like Baudelaire would point out, like what a great modern artist will do is point to the infinite and the eternal and the enduring elements of modern life, which by themselves are sort of characteristically the transient and the contingent and the fleeting. This is sort of what Harvey was talking about. And basically what then happens with postmodernism is sort of like, no, we're not even going to do that. We're just like going to wallow in the contingent. We're going to wallow in and we're going to just sort of celebrate total immanence in all of its immanent nature, right? And so then you see the sort of kind of cynical embrace of consumer culture as being like, yep, this is all there is, just a bunch of signs and surfaces and and what do? You just buy stuff and blah blah blah. And again, this is just sort of one reading of postmodernism, but I think that there's a lot of validity to that. And so then we're kind of like, well, this doesn't feel very good after a while, right? And you're sort of like, well, this isn't a very fulfilling life. And what about meaning? What about truth? Like, yes, I know that these things they don't really work anymore. And they're sort of, I'm sort of disillusioned with all that metaphysical notion of all that stuff. But at the same time, like, I need these things like that, And so there's this challenge, which eventually metamodernism sort of negotiates, right? Which is sort of the thesis that I have, which is that what this sacred thing is it doesn't rely on a two worlds mythology, right? You can have a sort of physicalist metaphysics, if you want to call it that, or a
naturalist. I prefer naturalism myself.
But you can have a fully naturalistic, even kind of monistic, in the sense that yes, all things are matter in some kind of fundamental way, right? And then it's like, it's not that what the sacred is something that's sort of fundamentally metaphysically other than that we're relating to in the sense of transcendence. It's that transcendent experiences happens within that immanent frame. And this isn't I don't want to make the suggestion that this is a totally novel kind of way of framing this, because in many ways, like the mystics have framed it this way, and when you get into the more esoteric elements of all the great religious axial traditions, there's a lot of this sort of way of thinking about it. But at least in popular conceptions, this wasn't really the way of thinking about it. And so when I think of the sacred, I'm thinking in terms of what are those experiences of the transcendent? And this is where some of this dovetails a little bit with stuff that like Layman and Bruce are doing with kind of post-metaphysical spirituality, where it's like you don't need to posit the whole transcendent metaphysics to just do the thing and it works, right? And so there's a lot of overlap there. And I think that, this also ties a lot in with the work that John's doing.
That's lovely. Let me give a little bit of my own history, sort of the logos architecture and personal history that's just super parallel with that. So I drop into behavioral science methodology. I'm a natural materialist, Dawkins-esque, God's a delusion kind of thing, right? And then I'm getting into the problems, especially at the fucking level of psychology, where you really have killed ontology. Okay, I argue that mainstream psychology essentially kills ontology because you can't solve the mind matter problem. It doesn't have the right descriptive metaphysics to get the ontology of the mental correct. So it then just defaults to epistemology and scientific method, and then it waves its hands. Oh, we're a science. But science is really about knowledge, and actually all you're really about is fucking method. And so that's my critique of mainstream psychology and the way it actually operates. And then so I'm on this journey, and then I back into justification. Okay. So now justification is my insight, and it does turn me into a postmodern frame, actually, because all of a sudden it's like, when I hit that, it was like, holy fuck, I'm just a justifying ape. All of the goddamn things I care about, even science, back myself up into, almost a Skinnerian. I'm a verbal behavior contingent processor. It's fucking, I'm just justifying, what it is that I'm doing. And so all of a sudden it's like, it's ironic, but and I'm just going to have to accept it, but it's kind of empty too. It's like you're hungering for something more. And then I fell into the tree of knowledge in 1997. I'm stoned one night and this thing pops out of me. And it's a very sort of naturalistic, but then transcendent thing, at least in relationship to justification. Because what it does is it puts you're no longer lost in the epistemology of justification once you get the tree of knowledge. Then you actually just see it as an ontology. And now you're outside of it and you can actually hold on to it with a much more ontological grounding rather than lost in the epistemological futility of it all. And so it rotated my shift, put me back both in terms of a natural science. And then I was called to label it the tree of knowledge, precisely because it was then actually on a transcendent arc, and then to redeem the transcendence through being itself in some ways, through recognizing ways of being that were fundamentally different. And I would use John's, sort of pragmatic transjective. I like to blend pragmatism with John's focus on transjective. And to me, that's like, okay, well, what that really does is like, there are different developmental arcs that land you in different places. And then you make value judgments about where you want to end up. And I don't want to end up in Nazi fucking Germany. That's that is hell on earth. And we can cultivate particular kinds of transjection, recursive relevance realization processes that land us in love with one another, and that becomes a very then clear differentiation. And I use then that at a pragmatic level of justification, what the good is, and then ultimately come to a much more sort of embodied structure and ultimately a thing called wisdom energy and the construction of the garden, which really then turns this into a fundamental transcending the logos, getting in touch with oneness, a much more sort of Eastern traditional kind of structure of being. So it's a really fascinating point for me, given my history, to listen to you narrate that and be like, man, I can track my own development on that pretty tightly.
And I think that you mentioned the introduction of sort of there's so many turns, right, in intellectual history, but this sort of pragmatic turn, which you mentioned, which is another way you could argue of talking about post-metaphysical spirituality, right? It's sort of a pragmatic, well, this works, but being able to, I think, how would I say, there's so much there, but when you think about justification systems, and then you're able to think about what their sort of pragmatic outcome is in the worlds that they lead to, and things of that nature, then you're able to talk about value and kind of relative good based on that system. And so you kind of are able to, in some ways, break free of that epistemological postmodern straitjacket of like, well, what's true and what's real and this and that, totally. Right? And you can start to be like, oh, okay, yeah, well, and that. And here's where stuff like the Hansian sort of metamodernist framework, and by extension integral models have been really helpful for me too, is sort of thinking about these justification systems along a developmental axis, and then you're sort of leading to different ways of embracing and thinking about these things, and then also locating the different conceptions of the sacred along that developmental axis, right? So when you think about my conception of the sacred when I was starting out in my evangelical period towards working in seminary, I had a very kind of particular God concept, right, that kind of operated in that particular meme that I was operating in that particular justification system. And then I show up to university and I start thinking and reading, and all of a sudden the justifications that I've been working with, they don't really work so well anymore. But I'm really attracted. There's an arrow to those justification systems as well, right? It's not just sort of they're not sort of arbitrarily or randomly related. It's like, oh, but this is taking me somewhere. And so even though it's incredibly hard to kind of experience the breakdown of your justification system and all of your associated values with it, there's something that brings you to do that in making that leap into sort of a new developmental terrain, as it were. So
I would just say, as long as you're on a developmental trajectory, as a clinician and watching people have existential crises that just implode them, there are cases in which people just get broken by life or by belief systems, and whatever they cling to then shattered. And we can hope that there's a regrowth after whatever existential dark night of the soul that melts and then hopefully reforms. Sometimes folks actually get broken, I think, and don't. But at the level of the kinds of trajectories we're talking about, what kinds of trajectories are really, I don't know, transjectively transcendent, whatever. These are the kinds of things that then grow out of the break. What comes after the break. And I
think at least a meaningful subset of the broken elements or the broken instances are when you kind of get to a point in a justification system when maybe it no longer coheres and is enough to kind of justify your world, but you're not really able to then take on a new one or the next one, as it were. Exactly. You know, and so then you're just sort of wallowing in, you know, and arguably that means that, well, okay, that's maybe that justification system matches your whole kind of being where you're at developmentally and all these things. And so, yeah, there's also this sort of unfortunate but hard to avoid impulse to be like, oh, if development exists, then everyone needs to go through the whole thing, right? And sort of like, well, you know, maybe, probably not. And maybe, you know, whether that, I mean, clearly, like, is that even possible, right? And whether or not that would even be beneficial is sort of a different question. So you start to appreciate the diversity of people's different religious and spiritual conceptions when you start to see, you know, that everyone's sort of working with a different set of sort of, justification propositions in some ways. And so, yeah. But the one for me, what I'm really interested in trying to probe is sort of like, all right, well, what is the sacred, what's the God concept in metamodernity, right? You know, what does that look like? And so, yeah, I think that's what I was just saying about sort of that immanent transcendent elision that happens and sort of looking for, you know, the way I kind of tend to think about it is like, there used to be this sort of dimensionality to the world that things had depth, right? And then when you lose, because you're working with more than one axis, as it were, right? There's like and then when you lose the other axis, because you're just sort of everything is immanence, then you lose depth, and then you lose meaning and significance. And I think that what the metamodern, what characterizes like a quintessentially sort of metamodern approach to thinking about spirituality and transcendence is you don't just reposit the old XY axis, you sort of look for a Z axis. You know, there's a way of sinking into immanence rather than just sort of like going out of it or something like that. And so there's a lot of ways that that can be explored. So I'm, you know, that'd be one way of answering sort of that sacred question, as it were.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the tree of knowledge affords a particular kind of perspective on this. At first, at it from an analytic perspective, it does grant a particular axis around complexification. And then the complexification is the differentiation of parts that then get unified in particular ways. And I think you can see a lot of what, you know, a unity differentiation and even what it sort of at least abstracts is ultimately sort of, there are complexification processes that then have to come together, as to say, and just at a general level, have to fight off, we'll say, entropy. Okay. And so entropy is constantly working against complexification. You have to pull in at a physics level, you have to pull in what's called a free energy rate density flow to use off of Eric Chiasson's just basic model. And I think we even, you know, maybe had some exchange in relation to that. And then you can track, I would argue, a free energy information flow if you bring in like Carl Friston's work, and you can put on top of that, and the tree of knowledge then just tracks this evolution of complexification. And then you can ask questions kind of systematically about what affords that negentropic complexified organization. And there are certain consistent processes that then begins. And I believe a lot of our value systems, our investment value systems, are oriented in relationship to this kind of harmonizing negentropic structure that is well positioned against the forces of entropy at higher and higher levels of complexification, which means that essentially the gravity of entropy is working harder and harder. And you have to be in more and more oriented flow to maintain that structure, because there's more and more forces that are pulling against you. You can extrapolate that concept, at least from a tree of knowledge perspective, and you place the garden on top of the tree of knowledge, and then you place what's called the elephant sun god on top of that. And then that becomes essentially your ultimate transcendent concern, a lodestar in relationship to trying to maintain the forces of negentropy that afford the complexification that give rise to the kinds of things that we call good, true, and beautiful.
Amen. Yes, I love it. I totally agree. I wanted to actually ask you a couple questions about this too, because when we spoke on my podcast, you'd mentioned the elephant sun god, and I was like, I want to hear more about that, which I do. But this also leads directly to the question I was going to ask, and slash a point I wanted to make too about what I think of metamodern spirituality, because, right, I mean, in the old kind of axial age, traditional sort of God concept and value concept and metaphysical framework of the world, right, you had a kind of, it's certainly under definitely kind of a, well, I'd say both Plato and Aristotle had versions of this, but there was a teleological element. There was a kind of a sense that there was an ultimate sense of good, right? And a lot of these ideas get just shellacked in the scientific revolution, and Darwinism comes around. It's like, no, there is no teleology. It's just this and that. And the idea of Hume comes along and kind of separates, is and not, all this stuff, right? And so then you're just sort of left in this, mechanistic kind of materialistic, blah, blah, blah. But what has been so exciting to explore and discover through your work and others is like you can start to resituate some of these the ideas that were intimated in those early philosophical frameworks and start to actually link them up to some really solid scientific complexity science, basically. And when you do that, you have a really solid basis for starting to talk about things like value and telos even. And so that was going to be sort of a point I was going to make, one also about the sacred, of sort of seeing personally, I identify that process as having a sacred quality to it, let's say. And I wanted to ask you what you thought of thinking about it that way. And then maybe just to throw onto that, I want to hear more about the elephant sun god. Convert me to the religion of the elephant sun god.
Yeah. Okay. Well, basically, first off, yes. I absolutely, I mean, the whole point of the tree of knowledge system is that the modern empirical natural science enterprise, which I sometimes call men's knowledge, and then I want to say it's limited and ultimately need wisdom-oriented knowledge, which becomes women's knowledge in the 21st century. So just out of play, I often play off metaphor, acronyms and things like that. But modern empirical natural science grabs a hold of a couple of different epistemologies, okay, and it creates this sort of objectivist, which is really an intersubjective objectivist frame, meaning you have a bunch of different observers that can then observe behavior. And then that behavior then can be tracked empirically in a particular way. And there are certain reductive mechanistic lines that can be drawn, meaning that you can get inside of things and then orient a particular cause effect down. And that's called reductionism. And that gives rise to a particular reductive, structural, mechanistic view of the world, which turns out to be unbelievably important for understanding a line of the world. But it's a line of the world, not the sphere of the world, if you will, or the entire field of the world. You actually need simultaneously, with a reductive analytic perspective, you actually need to see the whole thing. You need a developmental behavioral systems view, which is to contextualize whatever line you're placing in. And this is just at a general level. So there's an individual reductive line that then needs to place in a holistic field line. Okay, so, and scientists didn't really understand that in a general level. The tree of knowledge comes along and basically says, listen, people, you have mistaken the parts of these reductive lines for the behavioral whole. And we need to actually be able to contextualize your parts inside a behavioral whole to make any sense out of them at all. The idea that you could reduce it down to the parts and then specify what the whole would be is wrong. You have to be able to see the whole and then see the part in relation.
Right.
So what the tree of knowledge then affords is a fundamentally new map of big history that affords a descriptive metaphysical system of the knower to organize the whole in relation and then allow you to see the structural mechanistic insights that were generated by physics, but also recognize, as every fucking person did, well, before somebody like Laplace comes along and a few other people, it's like, we have developed a knowledge system of matter in motion for matter in motion, not for life, not for animal minds, not for human minds. They knew that they would need developments which become ultimately complex adaptive systems at one level. The tree of knowledge then comes along and actually gives us the descriptive metaphysics to delineate that ontology, to tie together meta theory and create a holistic picture. And so it can come along and then say, hey, it's got a thing called the periodic table of behavior that actually classifies the part-whole relations and affords clarity in relationship to the structural mechanism line. Also shows that it's just a line. You need also a holistic developmental behavioral systems view. If you know your integral theory, all that basically means is there's an individual exterior view and a collective systemic exterior view. And you need both of those from a science view, which, by the way, is only going to be the science view, not the interior individual or not the interior collective, which is going to be humanistic at an individual and collective level. So I'll stop there and basically say, yeah, well, first off, what was brought to bear through the tree of knowledge is the natural science project critique then that says you're never going to get your metaphysics right based on coming off of, so the E.O. Wilsons and Sean Carrolls of the world you can anchor the shit there, but you better get it right. And the reason is they actually don't have a holistic view, especially when they can hold mind. Tree of knowledge comes along because I'm a psychologist. And I'm like, I understand what the fuck happened with mind. I get the variables right, create a new map of big history. And then that's going to structure a naturalistic ontology that's actually going to be up to the task of the human soul and spirit. So that's the first step, is to be like, hey, we can go from physics to biology to psychology and the social sciences, but we need to do descriptive metaphysics to get the ontology correct.
Yeah, and then, so this is interesting because, like, so you mentioned Eric Chasson, or that's how I say his name, Chasson, but however you say his name,
Chiasson, I think. Maybe it's
yeah. You know, his work and free energy rate density and that sort of thing, and complexification, you can map all that. And he makes great pains at the beginning of his book, almost to a degree where you're like, you know, he doth to protest too much here, that he's like, there's no great chain and none of this is like, you know, spiritual or sacred or anything like that. And so, but what's interesting, and I think an open question, and in some ways a fraught and dangerous one, because you don't, well, let me finish the thought and then I'll qualify it, that there's the potential for seeing these things as being, what's the word? I mean, I guess just of being, imbued with, or no, that's not the right word. I guess just to use the word sacred again, you know, like if you think about what sacredness and sacrality is about, and about the way that your behavior adjusts to things that are perceived as sacred in a particular way, right? The imbuing of these things with importance, highly relevant, highly deeply meaningful, deeply emotionally impactful and affective, and these sorts of things, right? Which brings us back into the realm sort of aesthetics, because these are all the felt and sensed components of these things. It's sort of, for me, it's like, well, what if we treat these ideas with an air of sacredness about them, right? If, as you say, which I think is a great way of putting it, which is that our values are aligned to that which optimally and maximally, you know, produces sort of negentropic, you know, effects, as it were, so that as we complexify, there's sort of a kind of built-in range of potential value sets, right, that kind of are associated with that complexification process, and then are rooted in that complexification process, and thus, in some ways, meaningfully, if you buy into that, like grounds morality and ethics and potentially aesthetics and other things as being related to this process as we're sort of going through this. But kind of remains the next step to sort of view this spiritually, right? To then say, well, if this is true, and it's a big picture account of reality, and that reality specifically including human reality, our particular, you know, whether it's the apex or at least somewhere high up this complexity stack, right? Then this is a meta narrative that in the past, you know, meta narratives being imbued with their sense of like, well, this is what's important, and this is what is meaningful, and this is your basis for, you know, behaving and acting and operating in the world, right? Like this kind of gets framed, or at least is sort of set on a platter to be framed as sort of like in mythological terms, let's say.
Absolutely.
Of course, there's many dangers with doing that, because anytime you're taking a scientific framework and then either, well, yeah, then you're taking it sort of out from the kind of realm of strict scientific, you know, ways of thinking about it. There's always ways that can be a unfortunate way that can go. But that's how I would look at it. And so what you're talking about is the elephant sun god, that sort of is that kind of omega point, or this sort of thing at the top of that, is sort of like, well, what do we call that, and how do we relate to that, and what if we were intentional about mythologizing and mythopoetically giving symbolic form to, and imagining this sort of conception in these terms, in the sacred style, as Layman, to use his phrase, right? So that's it for me. Like that's what I'm all about.
Yeah, totally. So I'll just add, I love Eric's work as a physicist. Okay, so Eric Chiasson's work as a physicist. But what he doesn't get, he doesn't really, and he'll admit this, he plays around with the concept of information, but it's a very slippery concept. So he boxed down into the foundation of energy thermodynamic frame, hence the free energy rate density that he works from in relationship to structuring his argument. Okay, but if you actually pay attention to his the evolution of complexification argument, he puts something like an F-14 fighter jet as the most complex thing, because when you run the numbers on an energy rate density thing, you get the F-14 fighter jet. Okay.
Yeah.
And I've talked to him, and basically, my argument with him is that while you've mastered the bottom energy to matter line, and you sort of are tracking the lifeline, you actually bottom out in your understanding of information processing communication networks. And really what we're talking about is complex adaptive systems, and your free energy rate density system is really, we have to build in a free energy information rate density process. Okay, that affords information processing and communication. And what he's missing is the evolution of epistemic feedback loops, information knowing systems. Okay, so as a physicist, he doesn't really have a good framework for understanding the process by which the emergence and evolution of knowing systems, i.e. the process by which organisms, animals, and people actually generate information processing systems that model the environment and then use that for predictive processing to get ahead in a complex adaptive way. And I've talked to him. I mean, he came down here and we had a beer together and all this other stuff. And I shared, I said, hey, do you see these cones, Eric? I was like, Eric, the fucking cones are for a reason. It isn't just a straight line of energy rate density. There's actually something else happening. And I argue that what's actually happening is an epistemic process that as a psychologist, I have to deal with. And your framework is not. And in physics frameworks, they're ontological. They're, it's an unfolding wave of but then remember, there are knowing systems that actually get trapped in there. And you guys don't know how to do subjective construal knowing systems. You try to reduce them to your own, but actually they're a different kind of thing. The tree of knowledge says they're a different kind of language. And actually what the tree of knowledge does, that the cosmic evolutionary archaism doesn't place the knower in the fucking system. Okay, it's just an evolution of complexification. It's like, okay, so your F-15 fighter jet is equal to you figuring all this shit out? I was like, from my vantage point, no. It's like you and I are on a fundamentally different level of complexification. So your energy free rate density then doesn't really work, because empirically, at least by every intuitive measure, you and I are having a more complicated conversation than that F-15 fighter jet. And I was like, because it's the complexification of energy information networking that is actually operative in what the tree of knowledge maps. So we had that, dialogue. And what I would then say is that the tree of knowledge then affords the knower. I will say that there are a lot of big history people that kind of go spiritual, and he's a modernist, totally, Eric. And he's like, I hate that fucking shit. Because, and it does drive you crazy at some level. If you're a metaphysical naturalist, people start bringing in all sorts of concepts, and then they blend them together as if that actually makes sense. And they nod knowingly with all the anecdotal evidence. So you're like, but you just ruined coherence here. And that's a huge price to pay. And so he's frustrated with that, but it's like, I'm not costing you coherence. In fact, your system is actually still stuck with the problem of fucking psychology, because you actually can't get to mentation with meta. You die out at psychology, Eric. So anyway, we had all that conversation. And my bottom line is that once you get this, now you have a big history naturalistic map that's up to the task of managing this conversation descriptively and causally. Okay. Then we can flip into the process by which we are embedded in this conversation, and then start to get to value-based claims of embodied living. And then when we do that, now we've done a rotation from a scientific into a humanistic frame. When we're in a scientific humanistic frame, now all of a sudden, what's going to come available to us is our own valuation of the sacred.
Yeah, and just from my own personal experience, I can say I've talked to some fighter jets, and they're pretty dull. They're not great conversations.
Their justification systems are very lame.
No, I think you're right, and actually, I think maybe the context in which we did discuss some of this was on the listserv about trying to, because I think that there's an opening and some work that needs to be done of like, I think that it seems like it has a really good complexification at the level of matter. But as you point out, right, there are these other information processing things that then that's what we need to be measuring the complexity of, right? So it's not just the energy and that, that we're looking at. It's also then, how do we think about the complexity of the system of the human or the animal, let's say, nervous system? How do we think about the complexity of a human culture and by extension, sort of justification systems? So then the kind of interesting research program would be, well, do these different planes of reality, of these different levels of complexity of, matter, life, mind, culture, do they require different metrics that can deal with that sort of a thing? Which, this starts all becoming very interesting, because once you start really seeing the consilience between the science and the meta narrative, which is to say also then kind of the spiritual, they're not separate, right? Like these are like these almost become theological questions, you could even say,
Totally.
Yeah. So
well then this is okay. So here's another. So I mentioned like sincere irony. The other unbelievable empirical spiritual event I had was around what's called the singularity. Okay. So Ray Kurzweil, second charge of Google, develops this thing called Singularity University in 2005, I think it is, publishes The Singularity is Near. And what he's doing is he's tracking the evolution of accelerated complexity. And it's not very complicated. It's basically, if we have metrics of time till when big events happen, so say when brains were developed, or when sexual reproduction happened, or then in humans, like when the printing press happened. They're big, and then there's the distance between the next big event, okay? And if you measure the distance between the next big event, you can track it on a thing, and what's happening is next big event's happening faster and faster. There's a smaller and smaller amount of time. So the denominator on the time is going slower and slower as you get to the next one. And then that basically begins to elevate a curve, okay? And then if you're tracking a kind of complexification, then essentially big events that are starting to happen almost instantaneously, and you get the curve that goes vertical. And if he's tracking the acceleration, he claimed that, hey, by 2045, based on this accelerating exponential, you're going to get a vertical line. We're going to call that the singularity. And then we'll have opened up a whole nother dimension of complexification where new inventions are happening essentially instantaneously or whatever. Okay, so that's the singularity from his point of view. Well, then this Russian guy, Andrew Khodorov, sorry, I don't speak Russian, so I murdered that. But anyway, he comes along and he's like,
I was just going to say, you probably at this moment won't be in danger of offending any Russian sensibilities.
Right. Well, right. There are bigger issues on the Russian table in relationship to issues they're operating. So anyway, he goes on. He's like, well, that's all Western findings, at least the ones that are cultural. Obviously, the evolutionary ones are pretty. But we have our whole Russian, Eastern Asian history. And there are all these big events that happen to us, gunpowder and blah, blah, blah. And so he then takes the Russian history of major events, okay? And he plots the frequency with what are happening. And he shows it's the exact same curve, although he shows it's called a hyperbolic exponential rather than just a straight on exponential, which means the very final tail is actually speeding up at a faster and faster rate than Ray Kurzweil said. He uses this very simple hyperexparabolic curve to line Kurzweil's data and his data and what he finds is an unbelievable curvature, okay? Like at a 0.994 and a 0.996 degree of the R value, which is the correlational value of this particular curve mapping to this thing, which is unheard of in social science. I mean, this is like a physics thing, there's like, okay, we're gonna map this to the level of precision where we're tracking this line. That's what it looks like. And I don't mind make it slightly screwed up, it doesn't matter. But one of them, say the West line, once he recalculates it, it's not 2045, it's 2027. That is actually, this thing goes vertical. And on the Eastern Russian line, it's 2029. Okay. So 2029 is happening, between 2027 and 2029. And I'm just like, here at UTOK, so thinking out, oh my God, I figured out this kind of system that can pull all knowledge together and we can build this digital age. We can have this metamodern sensibility in this time between worlds. And there's a complexification curve that says in 8 years from now, this thing is going to go sort of vertical, and we would then enter into a new fifth dimension of complexification where the digital and our knowledge and our wisdom potentially emerge in a particular kind of way. And my little thread is part of that fucking line. And I'm seeing other brothers across the line, it's like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. People are seeing this shit, and I'm like, Jesus, I was like, hallelujah. I was like, if that isn't a goddamn, like, what is happening to that? And I'm agnostic in relationship to my foundational, but I'll just watch that. And I'll just watch what my body does to that. My body's like, you're seeing something. There is something that, whatever the hell that is, something's happening. So,
and then but then the question is sort of, well, there's a lot of questions, I guess, but one, I mean, a couple things. I mean, the question, I guess, immediately for me is like, you say that you're agnostic about the kind of foundational, ontological, metaphysical, element of it all. But like, at what point are we sort of justified in saying, hey, this seems to be a thing, and like this, there's like a structure here. And if it is going somewhere, right, that's question one. Cause like there's a religious impulse that kind of kicks in, our eschatology, right, turns on, and we're all like, hey, and then, but this is also the danger too, right? Because then we can become apocalyptic, and be like, oh, the end is near, 2027 is upon us, like the singularity, the fifth joint point, is upon us. And so there's sort of a delicate balance there. And I think maybe this is where some of that sincere irony can kind of do some work, right? Because like you kind of hold the things loosely enough that you don't kind of fall into that fanaticism of like, of going out into the street and kind of, whatever you could even do by going out into the street with a sign, right? But still, there's sort of like we hold the meta narratives loosely enough that we avoid the kind of worst parts of that idealism that we saw in not only modernity but also traditional kind of religious fanaticism,
which is exactly the function of the elephant sun god, at least.
So tell me about the elephant sun god. Why so the elephant sun god? What's the image about?
Right. So it was the concluding comment that I make in an essay, which basically is the story, my own narrative. It's called "Can You See the Elephant Sun God?" Okay. And it's my own narrative into this metamodern space. All right. And fundamentally, it relates to Alexander Bard and the concept of syntheism. Okay. It relates to my own awakening of a sincere, ironic metamodern sensibility and into this new space that, oh my God, there's a whole new cultural sensibility that I am now part of. Okay. And basically, it's in telling that story, it's a 7-page essay that ends with this kind of question: can you see the elephant sun god? The reference are a couple things you have to be aware of. So in my opening chapter of my book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology, it starts with from racing horses to seeing the elephant. Okay. And what it says is that what psychologists have done is they position their horses on schools of thought and then they race them against each other. Okay. And the proper metaphor, when you actually are able to see the whole, is the blind men and the elephant. Okay, so that each of them are grabbing an aspect of the human condition, and with a holistic narrative, you can weave that tapestry together and see the picture of the elephant rather than the various parts, and rather than race them competitively, you stitch them together to see the whole. So that's been a very common metaphor for me to grab a hold of in relationship to that. And then what I did ultimately in relationship to my what I came to believe. So I'm an agnostic, meaning I'm not foundationalist in terms of ontic. The ontic reality, is it spiritual? Is it energy? Is it whatever? What the hell comes before Big Bang? I don't fucking know. So I'm agnostic in relationship to that, meaning I'm not a foundational ontic person. Okay. I then adopt the strongest version of the epistemologically justified version of what is at the level of physics. So I'm like, okay, yeah, that shit I study that shit a lot, and was like a lot of fucking knowledge there, in relation. So then I'm going to ground my stuff on a natural science in terms of an ontological picture based on the correspondence theory of truth that science is. And I go, okay, we'll build that as a map relative to the territory of the ultimate nature of the territory I'm not sure of. I'm atheistic in relationship to the traditionalist pre-modern gods and their dual world mythology, which has a metaphysics that in ontology that really doesn't work. Okay. But then I become a syntheist. And with Bard's framing, basically what I do is I'm like, I believe in the concept of God. The concept of God works. And if we believe this whole notion that I laid out, Ryan Aslan, I'm blanking, he wrote a book that was influential to me called God, A Human History. And Karen Armstrong wrote a book called The Case for God. And both of these structure essentially God as that which you move towards when you embody transcendent practices, and it looks for what humans do when they get together and are oriented toward a healthy concept of God. Mm-hmm. Okay. So in both cases, I can now take the concept of God that has something, an enormously powerful idea for humans. Okay. And if we are then oriented toward the ultimate concern, and we can use this as a lodestar to abstract, say, these negentropic coordinating functions and then place them in our divine double, to use a Corbin term from John, which is like, I can project my ideal self and you can project yours, and we can find shared values and we can orient towards our ultimate concern. And the elephant sun god says, hey, there's a coherent integration, so of light, okay, and power that we can see also from a pluralistic angle. Notice the various parts of the elephant. You might see, so what I see, for example, from the garden is I see dignity and well-being with integrity. And then I ultimately see also wisdom energy. So these are my fundamental values. If you come to me as a Christian and you're like agape, it's lovable, and somebody else says, it's freedom embedded in dignity for, it's nirvana, it's a particular kind of emptiness and oneness. There's lots of different variants in relationship to this ultimate concern relation, okay? But they're all going to actually have particular resonant frequencies. So it's a coherent, integrated, pluralistic icon for the good. That's our ultimate concern, however we might position ourselves, depending on our particular and collective, group, community, belief system around what the good, true, and beautiful is.
Yeah, definitely. And I was like, give me an icon of the elephant sun god, right? And then, but this is, yes. So I think it's a beautiful way of putting it. And I mean, I have a million thoughts based on all of that, but I feel like with all the resonances that are there, right, there's like, all this is just very exciting for, the prospect of thinking this sort of age-old kind of long desire, basically since the scientific revolution happened, and people started to see some light between, the church, let's say, and what those crazy alchemists and scientists were up to. Well, less so the alchemists, but, and it's sort of like, these are kind of doing different things. Basically, since we started losing that whole transcendent thing, it's like this transcendent, the return of transcendence reimagined, as it were, is in a science, not just science friendly, but where the convergence of the scientific meta narrative and a kind of spiritual meta narrative are coming together is that's potent stuff. And
totally. Yeah. I mean, the word unified is borrowed from conciliance. Whatever I define unified, it's conciliant. Mm-hmm. And E.O. Wilson fails at conciliance because he's anchored to an ineffective natural science metaphysics. But we can upgrade the natural science metaphysics, and when we do it through the tree of knowledge, all of a sudden, a revitalization of transcendence in many of the embodied practice ways of the wisdom traditions becomes very alive and available. And now all of a sudden, yes, you have a conciliant connection between a postmodern meta-narrative spirituality and a proper conception of what actually science teaches us holistically, balanced with the reductive insights it affords, but holistically. And then now you actually have a very rich science and a very rich spirituality that are conciliant, complementarity to each other. And then you're like, well, that should be something powerful.
Yeah. And then for me, I'm like, poets to come. Like, where are the artists here? Let's give this beautiful aesthetic symbolic.
Right. Or else it's going to look like that shit.
Well, speaking of pluralism, we just need, we need a whole bunch of different styles and voices, and it's got to become a cultural production. That's where you're calling for. I totally, and that's, to me, that's right. There is and actually we can even put it more, if we use some of Zach Stein's framing, okay, we're actually in an educational crisis. And by that, he means a fundamental need to consider the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Okay. And if we don't get that, and there are lots of reasons why this is a great diagnosis of the fundamental challenge of our time between worlds, because it's what knowledge are we able to extract from the past, okay, that we can internalize and trust and grant to our children as the world faces both the multiplicity of all these problems and changes so fast, right? So what knowledge is going to, and within that context, we're now surrounded in bullshit in our chaotic, fragmented pluralism. Okay. So with all of these issues, there is a deep problem that we're facing, what I call the digital identity problem, but it's another word for the meta crisis. And if there's an opportunity of a subset of individuals that are actually weaving together a tapestry that does afford a path through this fifth joint point or whatever, then the singing about that, the writing about that,
The artistic creative expression in relationship to that is absolutely crucial to the entire process of the collective awakening that needs to happen pretty fucking fast. We don't have a fucking century. This thing actually needs to be happening. So anyway, anyway, go ahead.
I was just, I mean, like that's also the function of mythos, is like that mythos is the contextual, symbolic, social, imaginary, religious, imaginary container in which cultural transmission happens, and in which education happens, really. And so with all these overlaps between, it's not just that the narrative itself is evolutionary and complexifying and developmental in nature. It's also that it needs to be translated in terms of different developmental styles and registers. It needs to be downloadable from different within different current justification systems, you could say. That we need, and so this then becomes a sort of Bildung, process of like, this is I'm tempted to take your mention of Bard and Syntheism and all that as sort of a potential segue into Dark Renaissance stuff, but at the same time, I'm really jamming on all this stuff. So
I mean, to me, I'll be honest, I try not to get defined against anybody, unless I really have to be. And I learned that as I was synthesizing all the psychologies, I was watching the ways in which, the leaders would get defined against others, trying to stake out a strong position. And then it was almost always the way they tried to strengthen and assert their position against the others that would then lock them into actually an extreme position that was wrong, outside the dialectic. Okay? So for me, what I'm doing, at least my position and style, is just let's watch everybody. What the fuck?
Anyway. I completely agree with that, and I've tried to play that balance as well, because I think that that's ultimately right, and especially so it's kind of ironic, if you will, because at the same time, there's an element of this metamodern sensibility, which I think is really beautiful and precious, and in some ways kind of fragile too, right? It has enough kind of paradox to it that it's easy enough for people to kind of resolve that tension of ironic sincerity, either towards one end or the other, right? And so, I mean, you see either some people are attracted to it because they're sort of a kind of, they're critiquing postmodernism, and that sort of thing, or, I'm a postmodernist and I get the whole, irony thing here, and I want to maintain that really precious balance. And so I've to the extent that I've got, a horse in the race of critiquing, of trying to be in the business of, I forget the way you just said it, but like being against something or being contra something, whatever. It's only, I mean, I suppose arguably everyone's intentions are relatively like this, but there's sort of like, there's a desire that you want to preserve something that you think is good. And so that sensibility is what I want to be like, let's not lose that.
I really, I mean, I was in the minority. I wanted to support the little video on the Dark Renaissance thing. When I did my little thing with Bard, UTOKing with him, I consider him a deep and good friend. But it was Dark Renaissance versus Enlightenment 2.0, and I'm Enlightenment 2.0. I'm more on the Bildung into Game B I'll see what happens to the term metamodern, but with the way sincere irony hit me, and the way the whole postmodern grand meta narrative and the whole sensibility of this community. I think that the Dark Renaissance shade of it is beautiful, but I just see it as one shade. And really the epicenter for me is much more metamodern Game B. At least that's where I am. And ultimately UTOK's an Enlightenment 2.0 mission. It's like, I just want to hone in analytically, at least at the level of pure logos justification. My position is I don't really give a shit about all the political shit. It's like there's an analytic problem that we fucked up in relationship to what happened with science, matter and motion, onto epistemology. I can fix that. And then we're going to see what happens, but it certainly then situates me in a metamodern Game B Enlightenment 2.0 vision, as that's what I take out my line.
No, definitely. And I there's sort of the irony I was going to gesture to is just that, like, if you see a kind of uptick in hyper auto critique, you know, and sort of like hyper sort of potentially cynical readings of like all this stuff that then leads to fissuring and all this stuff. Then you're in a position where it's like, well, you have to critique, which isn't really a good position to be in, sort of counterproductive. So I think you're right. I mean, it's better to kind of try to see this, you know, I like Joe Lightfoot's liminal web because it kind of encapsulates this into a broader kind of ecology. But yeah, I think that there's always a kind of challenging, and I deal with this a lot moderating this Metamodern Spirituality Facebook group. Like when you try to kind of cultivate a certain ethos and a certain level of engagement and connection that's hopefully really edifying and good for people. That can often mean having to be like, oh, I'm going to not allow shit posters. I'm going to have to not allow the people coming in who just want to, you know, take things down, you know, figuratively speaking. And so then you're in that weird balance of like having to say no because you want to say yes to things. And it's kind of a classic paradox.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so I feel like any community is going to kind of have to negotiate those sorts of things. And, you know, I think that healthy debate is always a good thing. But then it's always like, well, what if it's not healthy, right? And then,
I thought that, to me, the thing seemed healthy. I mean, and just in terms of the conversations that you participated in, what happened on the list, some of the post conversations on the Stoa and things like that. I like that little slice. And I'm basically in love with my people. I mean, I've found, you know, this structure. I've said that to a number of people. Like, I think I found my people here.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I share that sentiment very much. So yeah.
We're about at the hour and a half marker. You know, I'd like to, we sort of look at the horizon of the conversation and the horizon of your own sense of future. As you look out, or as you came into this conversation, is there anything that you want to sort of share as you look out on the horizon, or that you want to make sure that we cover in the context of this discussion?
Well, one, I do want to mention again that retreat, which is happening.
Yes, let's come back to that. That'd be great.
Yeah, so that's happening in May 13th to the 15th.
We'll put that in the show notes. A little, I like that little, you know,
the video. Yeah,
1 minute.
Thank you for sharing that around.
Of course.
Yeah, so that's coming up. It's really, I mean, today's March 1st, or so. It's, you know,
that's right. March, April. You know, all of a sudden we'll be there.
Not too far away. But yeah, it's going to be here in Vermont at Sky Meadow Retreat, which is the retreat center that I'm the caretaker at, and the homesteader. And so I'm really looking forward to that. It'll be the first time I'm going to meet, you know, a lot of fellows of the tribe in person. And so I'm really excited for that. You're going to be here. You're going to be giving a talk on UTOK.
UTOKing now.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Layman Pascal is going to be kind of leading the majority of it, but Bruce Alderman will also be here, and we've got a number of people, double digits now signed up. So it's going to be a full, beautiful event. So I want to mention that, and then just to also plug my own work again. If people are interested in any of these topics, this is sort of when I say I've kind of been engaged with this kind of stuff for, you know, a little over a decade. It's sort of these ideas. And so I just recently kind of re-released a different version of that epic poem I mentioned at the outset of our conversation. Okay. So I found that a 500-page epic poem, if you just kind of throw it out into the ether, it's a little bit too much to chew on. And so what I did is I kind of made a kind of anthologized version, which kind of gives you all the relevant context, but it's the selected passages that are the most relevant to this community, to metamodernism, to the liminal web. It's called The God Emerging. And so I kind of dispense with all that war in heaven epic stuff pretty quickly, and then kind of get into where are we now and where are we going. And yeah, the idea of like, what is the God emerging? You have the image of the elephant sun god, which I love and will use. I also have this image of the kaleidoscopic eye, which relates to other things.
Yes.
So anyway, it's sort of a mythopoeic dealing with our potential future, and sort of I wrote it, as I said, in that period when I had yet to encounter this community, but I was sort of intuiting that it would arise. And so I kind of imagine, you know, that this guy goes in search of God to bring back some element of the sacred. He comes back from the underworld, and who does he find but this group of artists and thinkers, you know, on the edge of the city, who are disillusioned with everything and want to overthrow the beast and the salesman, and you know, set up something meaningful and beautiful. So yeah,
it's a fucking premonition.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, I've been waiting, you know, for this sort of community. So I hope that if people feel that they really, you know, grok all the stuff that we're talking about, that this is just kind of my first major attempt to try to mythopoetically express a lot of these ideas and deal with them. So yeah, I'd love to throw that out there. And the last thing I'll say is just that where my horizons are is, as I've been saying, trying to translate this stuff, your work and the work of others that kind of constitutes this metamodern meta-narrative into mythic form. And I've been working on this now for a little bit in a project I haven't released anything about yet, but that'll be coming soon. And so more on that to come. There's, I think it'll be a really special, interesting thing. And I expect this to be a very long-term project. It's a very, you know, it'll be a very, sizable sort of project in a kind of Dantean vision. But so more on that to come. But and yeah, I suspect we'll be in touch about that as well, because there's a lot of input that I want from the kind of figures and thinkers who are articulating these ideas to kind of, in some ways, be a part of the, you know, collaborative, co-creative element of giving expression to them as well. So I want this sort of to be not just a work that I'm doing, but also something that I'm taking in your work, and I'm taking in Hansi's work, and, you know, integral stuff, and I'm kind of in, you know, all this stuff, right, and kind of expressing it in symbolic mythopoetic form in a story with art and all these other things. So
that's so awesome.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's just great. Yeah, it's a glorious connection, friend. I mean, I definitely feel a spiritual, you know, brotherhood with you in relationship to this, and I can feel that in our stories, and just that you're doing that, and that we're doing our thing in parallel and complementary ways is joyful. So I really deeply appreciate your work.
Love it. Yeah, and I can't wait to meet you in person in May. So that'll be a
man. I'll bring you up an iQuad coin.
I would love that. I'd love that.
Definitely bring you up an iQuad coin. So, and we'll put your links in the show notes and all of that. Cool. And thanks so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and vision. It's been great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
All right. Well, we'll be in touch.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.